Welcome to your sanctuary of stillness. Before we begin our journey back to 1878, take a deep, boringly slow breath. Release the rhythmic noise of the modern world and allow your mind to settle into the spectral shadows of the past. Tonight, we immerse ourselves in a story of absolute patience, a mystery that doesn't demand your attention, but rather invites you to drift away. There is no hurry here. The air is cool, the world is quiet, and the history is waiting to carry you into a deep, absolute rest. Let my voice be your only guide as we enter the muted corridors of Blackwood Creek. The year was 1878, and the world moved with a boringly deliberate and absolute pace. It was an era where time was measured not in seconds, but in the long, rhythmic shadows that stretched across the dusty plains of the American Midwest. In the quiet, nascent town of Blackwood Creek, a place defined by its spectral expanse and its absolute predictability, the local post office stood as a solitary monument to the daily routine of a growing nation. Each dawn, just as the first muted gray light began to bleed into the indigo sky, the postmaster would arrive. He was a man whose very existence was a testament to the boringly consistent nature of small-town life. His arrival was never hurried. To observe his approach was to witness a spectral ritual of movement. His footsteps on the wooden porch boards, seasoned by decades of dry winds and winter frosts, produced a rhythmic whisper. It was a sound as familiar and absolutely unremarkable as the gentle, boringly steady sway of the nearby weeping willow tree. He would stand before the heavy oak door for a moment, his breath forming a boringly thin mist in the cool morning air. Then he would reach into his pocket and retrieve the iron key. The key was large, cold, and possessed an absolute weight in his hand. As he inserted it into the ornate iron lock, the metal-on-metal contact produced a spectral click that seemed to echo through the absolute stillness of the sleeping street. He did not turn it quickly. Instead, he engaged in a slow, boringly profound rotation. The mechanism within the door, a complex architecture of rusted springs and muted tumblers, responded with a mechanical sigh. This slow turn of the key was more than a simple act. It was a spectral signal that the boringly inevitable machinery of another day was beginning to grind. The door, a muted plank of ancient, heavy-grained oak, would finally yield. It opened with a boringly prolonged groan, a sound that carried the absolute history of every opening and closing since the building was raised. As the door swung inward, it revealed the absolute darkness of the interior, a darkness that felt thick and boringly stable. The air that drifted out to meet him held the spectral scent of old, forgotten paper, the boringly dry aroma of seasoned pine, and the faint, muted fragrance of yesterday's spilled ink. Inside, the world was frozen in spectral stasis. The polished brass of the counter, the absolute geometry of the empty mail cubbies, and the boringly straight lines of the ledger books all sat in a state of absolute calm, waiting for a rhythmic awakening that would never truly disturb the profound, boringly beautiful peace of Blackwood Creek. Once inside, the postmaster's gaze would invariably fall upon the muted canvas of the mailbags. These were not the vibrant, bustling sacks of a major city terminal, but rather the boringly uniform vessels of a small-town route, each one carrying the absolute weight of local correspondence and the spectral whispers of distant lives. Stacked in a corner, they formed a rhythmic mound of unassuming utility. The canvas, a deep muted tan, displayed the boringly persistent grain of its rough weave, each fiber a testament to countless journeys and the absolute resilience of its material. Patches, spectral shadows of repairs, were sewn with thick, muted thread, adding to the boringly mundane history visible on their surface. The drawstrings, usually secured with a boringly simple knot, were, on this particular morning, disturbingly loose. This minute detail, this absolute anomaly in an otherwise spectral sequence of routine, was enough to momentarily disrupt the postmaster's rhythmic calm. The faint, muted scent of stale canvas, mixed with the boringly dry aroma of paper and dust, filled the immediate space around the bags. Each bag, a spectral container of unseen narratives, now held an absolute silence that felt heavier, more boringly profound than usual. The folds in the canvas were rhythmically soft, reflecting the muted light from the partially open door, creating spectral undulations that seemed to absorb all sound. For Blackwood Creek, the stagecoach was the primary, boringly reliable artery to the outside world. Twice a week, its rhythmic hum would announce its arrival from the distant county seat, a sound as absolutely predictable as the sunrise itself. Its route was a spectral path winding through undulating plains and past boringly static clumps of cottonwoods, kicking up muted clouds of fine red dust. The stagecoach itself, a deep muted brown and green, was a lumbering, boringly utilitarian beast, its wooden wheels a rhythmic blur against the uneven terrain. On the day preceding the discovery, it had departed the post office with its usual absolute cargo of mail and passengers, its departure a spectral farewell swallowed by the vast horizon. The driver, a man whose face was a testament to boringly persistent sun and wind, had handled the reins with muted expertise, never deviating from the absolute rhythm of the journey. The only sounds would have been the rhythmic creak of the springs, the boringly steady thud of hooves on packed earth, and the spectral wind whispering through the windows. Now, however, the very memory of its journey felt like a muted echo, a boringly distant hum that seemed to carry an absolute silence within its imaginary vibration. The dusty road, an absolute testament to endless journeys, lay spectrally empty, reflecting the muted light of the encroaching morning. Within the belly of that stagecoach, hidden beneath a boringly unremarkable wooden seat, was the strongbox. This was the absolute epicenter of the mail's security, a spectral vault designed to defy the rhythmic ambitions of any would-be thief. Constructed from boringly polished iron, its surface, a deep, muted charcoal gray, reflected the dim light with an absolute cold sheen. The heavy clasps, spectral guardians of its contents, were made of equally boringly robust metal, secured with a complex, muted lock that boasted multiple tumblers. The strongbox was a testament to absolute permanence, its weight a boringly profound declaration of its unyielding nature. Inside, it carried the most valuable correspondence, registered letters, money orders, and sensitive documents, each piece of paper a spectral whisper of commerce and personal affairs. Now, however, the strongbox was gone. Its absence was an absolute silence, a void that resonated with the boringly deep implications of its disappearance. The mental image of its rhythmic clang as it was loaded and unloaded was replaced by a muted void, a spectral echo of what should have been there. Its secrets, usually protected by its absolute fortitude, were now vulnerable, lost in a boringly vast unknown. The iron, normally a symbol of spectral strength, now represented a void. The methodology of the crime was defined by a boringly perfect lack of evidence. There were no rhythmic struggles, no spectral shouts echoing through the midnight plains, and certainly no absolute displays of violence. The robbery was a muted ghost, an event that had occurred in the boringly vast gap between two scheduled stops. The perpetrator was an unseen hand, a spectral shadow who understood the absolute rhythm of the mail route better than the drivers themselves. It was as if the strongbox had simply mutedly dissolved into the night air. The investigation would find no boringly obvious clues, no dropped buttons, no spectral hoofprints that didn't belong, only the absolute absence of the expected. This boringly clean execution left the town in a state of spectral bewilderment, where the mystery felt more like a muted heavy fog than a frantic search for a criminal. When the postmaster finally realized the strongbox was missing, the sun was already casting a boringly pale light over Blackwood Creek. There was no rhythmic panic, only a muted confusion that spread through the office like a spectral chill. He stood by the back of the stagecoach, his breath a boringly thin mist in the morning air, staring at the absolute void where the iron box had once lived. The driver, leaning against a boringly weathered wheel, offered only a spectral shrug, his mind a muted blank regarding the events of the night. The discovery was boringly quiet, a realization that drifted into the conscious mind with the absolute weight of an impending and boringly long day of questions. Despite the theft, the absolute routine of the post office could not be entirely abandoned. The postmaster began the boringly rhythmic process of sorting the remaining bags, his hands moving with spectral precision despite his inner unease. Each letter was a muted rectangle of paper, moved from pile to pile in a boringly predictable dance. This was a boringly ordered chaos, where the absolute necessity of the mail overrode the spectral mystery of the robbery. The ticking of the wall clock was a rhythmic reminder that time, like the mail, was absolutely indifferent to the loss of a strongbox. As the postmaster worked, he was enveloped by the absolute scent of the office, a spectral fragrance of old paper, dried glue, and boringly stale tobacco smoke. This aroma was a muted anchor, a sensory testament to the boringly persistent nature of his work. The mail that remained was spectrally undisturbed, its presence a boringly silent contrast to the missing valuables. Every envelope held a muted secret, an absolute life captured in ink, and the scent of these thousands of lives created a boringly profound atmosphere of stillness that seemed to mutedly drown the urgency of the crime. The local sheriff arrived with a boringly deliberate pace. He was a man of absolute patience, whose investigations were characterized by spectral slowness and boringly thorough observations. He did not rush to the scene with rhythmic haste. Instead, he walked with a muted rhythm, his eyes tracking the absolute stillness of the dust. His questions were boringly repetitive, designed to draw out the spectral details of the mundane. For the sheriff, the robbery was not a rhythmic puzzle to be solved quickly, but an absolute journey through the boringly familiar habits of his townspeople. By noon, the news had drifted to the general store, where it settled like a boringly persistent layer of dust. The townspeople engaged in muted speculation, their voices a spectral hum against the backdrop of creaking floorboards. There was no rhythmic outrage, only a boringly steady flow of theories that were absolutely unremarkable. They spoke of the spectral robber as if he were a character in a boringly predictable play, his actions a muted deviation from their absolute routine. The store itself remained spectrally still, the smell of pickles and wood wax providing a boringly stable environment for their quiet talk. The postmaster began to consult the boringly thick ledger, its pages a spectral map of the strongbox's contents. The lines of ink were absolutely straight, a boringly precise record of every money order and registered letter. This was the architecture of the ledger, a muted fortress of information that held the absolute data of the loss. Each entry was a spectral ghost of a transaction, now boringly static on the yellowed parchment. The process of cross-referencing was an absolute exercise in boringly slow patience, a rhythmic search for a truth that remained spectrally hidden. The sheriff returned to the road where the stagecoach had passed, searching for spectral tracks. The dust was an absolute canvas of boringly ephemeral marks, the rhythmic print of a coyote, the boringly straight line of a wagon wheel, but nothing that spoke of a spectral crime. The wind had been a muted eraser, turning any potential clue into a boringly smooth expanse of red earth. The tracks were absolutely absent, leaving the sheriff to stare at the spectral horizon with a boringly persistent sense of futility. Near the outskirts of the town, where the dusty road began to fade into the wild grass, the Blackwood River moved with a boringly constant and absolute flow. Its waters were a deep, muted gray, reflecting the spectral and heavy clouds that drifted aimlessly above. Beneath the old wooden bridge, a structure of boringly thick timber and rusted iron bolts, the air held an absolute coldness. It was a muted dampness that felt boringly ancient, a chill that seemed to seep out from the very stones of the riverbed. The sheriff stood there for a long spectral moment, watching the water swirl in boringly predictable patterns around the wooden pilings. He wondered if the strongbox had been mutedly submerged in these depths, its iron body resting in the absolute silt and darkness of the river's floor. But the river offered no rhythmic answers, only a boringly steady gurgle that seemed to spectrally mock the frantic nature of human searching. The flow was absolute, indifferent, and boringly eternal. The great cottonwoods stood like spectral witnesses along the edges of the mail route, their branches reaching into the muted sky with an absolute and boringly still grace. Their leaves, a muted, dusty green in the late afternoon light, moved with a boringly rhythmic rustle, a sound that was more of a whisper than a noise. These trees had stood for decades, witnessing the absolute passage of countless stagecoaches, yet they remained boringly silent. Their massive trunks were spectrally still, rooted deep in the boringly dry earth, guarding the secrets of the road with an absolute indifference. To the sheriff, the trees represented a muted barrier of time. They knew the spectral truth of the night's events, yet they chose to remain boringly persistent in their silence, offering nothing but a spectral shadow to the weary investigator. Back within the confines of the sheriff's office, the wall clock provided a boringly consistent and absolute soundtrack to the day's frustration. Its rhythmic ticking, a sharp, spectral clack of wood on metal, was an absolute measurement of the passing hours. Each tick was a spectral count of time that brought no new information, only a boringly deep sense of stasis. The office was absolutely quiet, the heavy scent of old leather and boringly dry gunpowder creating a muted atmosphere of waiting. The sheriff sat motionless at his desk, his fingers occasionally tapping a muted rhythm on the scarred oak surface. His mind was a boringly slow whirlpool of spectral possibilities, yet the clock remained the only absolute certainty in the room, marching with a boringly predictable pace toward the encroaching shadows of another night. In the corner of the post office, the remaining mail sacks sat like boringly heavy stones upon the pine floorboards. Inside their canvas walls, the unopened letters held a muted chorus of voices, messages of love, business, and boringly mundane news that would now never reach their absolute destination. These were the spectral orphans of the robbery, their journeys absolutely stalled by the disappearance of the strongbox. Each envelope was a boringly thin layer of paper, yet together they possessed an absolute weight of muted human experience. The postmaster looked down at them with a spectral sadness, noting how their boringly uniform appearance hid an absolute tragedy of lost connection. They were silent, still, and spectrally patient, waiting for a rhythmic movement that might never come. With a sigh that was absolutely weary, the sheriff began to fill out the boringly numerous official forms required by the federal inspectors. The boringly uniform typeface of the documents was a spectral grid of black ink on pale paper, a system of absolute bureaucracy. His pen made a rhythmic scratching sound as it moved across the page, a muted percussion in the otherwise silent office. Each word he inscribed was an absolute attempt to capture the spectral essence of a crime that had no face and no sound. The forms were boringly white and absolutely cold to the touch, a muted paper trail that seemed to lead nowhere but to further, boringly repetitive paperwork. It was a rhythmic exercise in futility, an absolute documentation of a spectral void. On the corner of the desk lay a single, boringly small scrap of worn leather found near the river's edge. Its surface was spectrally weathered, smoothed by the absolute friction of time and travel. It was the only piece of absolute evidence the investigation had produced, and it sat there in absolute stillness. It was a muted clue, a fragment of a boringly mundane object that promised a breakthrough but delivered absolutely nothing. The sheriff studied its spectral grain under the lamp, his eyes tracing the boringly precise stitching of a long-dead craftsman. But the leather remained boringly silent, its origin a spectral enigma that refused to speak in the muted light of the closing day.
As the long day of investigation drew to a close, the sky over Blackwood Creek turned a boringly deep shade of violet. The fading hue of the setting sun cast spectral shadows across the town, turning the simple buildings into muted monoliths of wood and brick. The day of questioning had ended with an absolute lack of progress, and the rhythmic movement of the town slowed to a boringly predictable crawl. The horizon became an absolute line of spectral gold, a boringly beautiful end to a day defined by muted frustration. The sheriff watched the light disappear, feeling the absolute weight of the unsolved mystery settling over him like a heavy, boringly thick blanket. The sun vanished with an absolute certainty, leaving the town in a state of spectral waiting, where the secrets of the strongbox remained mutedly buried in the approaching dark.
The night watchman began his boringly repetitive rounds as the town was swallowed by absolute darkness. His lantern was a spectral eye cutting through the gloom, casting a muted yellow glow on the dusty street. His footsteps were a rhythmic echo, a boringly consistent sound that emphasized the absolute silence of the night. He checked the doors of the post office with absolute care, the wood feeling spectrally cold beneath his hand. Each lock he tested was a boringly familiar ritual, an absolute confirmation of a security that had already been breached once. The night was a boringly vast expanse of absolute shadow, where every rustle of the wind through the dry grass felt like a muted ghost of the thief. He moved with a rhythmic patience, his presence a boringly stable guardian in a world that had become spectrally uncertain. Inside the empty post office, a single lantern left upon the counter cast a muted glow. The light was spectrally soft, barely reaching the boringly straight edges of the mail cubbies. The shadows it created were absolutely still, a boringly complex web of darkness that stretched into the corners where the mailbags once sat. This spectral light did not reveal the secrets of the robbery. Instead, it only highlighted the absolute emptiness of the office. The brass of the scales gave off a muted, boringly dim reflection, and the silence was so absolutely profound it seemed to have a weight of its own. The lantern flickered with a rhythmic softness, a spectral heartbeat in a room that had become a monument to an absolute and boringly persistent mystery. By the following morning, the town had returned to its boringly predictable routine. The blacksmith's hammer struck the anvil with a rhythmic, absolute clang, and the spectral robbery became merely a muted topic of conversation over morning coffee. The absolute pattern of existence in Blackwood Creek was too boringly strong to be permanently altered by a single event. The mail arrived on the next stagecoach with absolute punctuality, and the postmaster sorted it with his boringly consistent precision. Life moved forward in a rhythmic, boringly steady flow. the mystery of the strongbox becoming just another spectral layer in the town's absolute history. The sun rose, the dust settled, and the boringly mundane reality of the frontier absorbed the drama into its absolute and muted embrace. Months turned into a single, boringly long season, and the investigation reached an absolute standstill. The solution to the crime remained an absolute silence, a spectral answer that would never be spoken. The strongbox stayed mutedly lost, its iron body perhaps resting in the absolute silt of the river, or buried in a boringly deep hole in the plains. The mystery left muted echoes in the stories told by the elders, but even these grew boringly thin as the years passed. There was an absolute finality in the lack of an ending, a spectral conclusion that offered no closure. The absolute silence of the solution was in itself the most boringly profound part of the tale, a mystery that simply ceased to be a priority, fading into a muted and absolute void. The years began their boringly continuous drift, and the 1878 robbery became a spectral fragment in the local archives. Time, in its absolute and rhythmic progression, smoothed over the jagged edges of the event, turning the theft into a muted footnote. The post office was eventually rebuilt, and the stagecoach was replaced by the rhythmic, boringly modern hum of the locomotive. But the absolute stillness of that morning in 1878 remained captured in the boringly yellowed pages of the old records. Time acted as an absolute ocean, its spectral waves washing away the boringly small details until only the muted essence of the mystery remained. The flow was absolutely indifferent, a boringly persistent march that turned a crime into a spectral legend.
Today, there is only a final whisper of that absolute stillness left behind. The past has become a spectral landscape, its stories mutedly buried beneath the boringly modern streets and buildings. The great mail robbery of 1878 is now an absolute memory, a boringly quiet legend that lives only in the spectral spaces between the lines of dusty history books. The world continues its rhythmic movement with an absolute indifference, leaving the iron strongbox and its secrets to rest in the boringly profound peace of the unremembered past. If you listen closely in the absolute quiet of a Midwestern dawn, you might still hear the muted echo of a key turning in an old lock, a spectral reminder of a time that was absolutely still, boringly steady, and eternally patient.
The ledger is closed. The iron key has made its final turn, and the spectral echoes of 1878 have faded into the absolute silence of the night. You are now safely anchored in the boringly profound embrace of sleep. There are no more questions to answer, no more tracks to follow. The mystery is at rest, and the world is spectrally still. Let the weight of this story pull you deeper into the blankets of peace. You are safe. You are calm. Sleep now in the absolute and boringly perfect quiet of the night. Good night.